a.m. in New York City. Good morning. I'm Bonnie Quinn with your Bloomberg Brief. Here's what you need to know. A new leader. Venezuela swears in Delcy Rodriguez as acting president as her predecessor, Nicolas Maduro, pleads not guilty in U.S. court. An AI showdown in Vegas. NVIDIA says its Rubin data center processors are in production. More from CES coming up. And stocks extending the New Year's rally. Copper continues its climb above $13,000 a ton. So let's take a look at these markets. We are mixed on futures right now, although we had an update for both the S&P 500 and the Nasdaq yesterday. The Nasdaq up about 0.75% for the Nasdaq 100. And you can see that tech optimism continuing overnight in the Asia session, with the MSCI Asia Pacific Index up another 1.2%. Now, I do want to point out the PVOC just out with lines as well, saying that it's going to restore market confidence and do a lot to continue to prove that its markets are trustworthy and investable. So we'll be looking into those headlines in just a few minutes as well. Let's take a look at the US bond universe, because obviously we're all waiting on that jobs data Friday, but we do get a raft of data in between. You're seeing the 2-year yield hold steady around 3.45, the 10-year yield just up very slightly, and the 30-year yield as well up almost 2 basis points. So that steepening trend continues. And I just want to point to copper as well, because we're seeing the base metals rally. Iron ore is the only sort of one that's been left out of the party. It's not rallying. There's a bit of a glut out there. But copper was above $13,000 an ounce again, or a ton, I should say, again today. And we've seen that a couple of times now over the holiday period and yesterday as well. Now let's get to some individual movers. We'll go across to London and Valerie Teitel. Valerie.
Good morning, Ivani. Let's start with Vistra. This has to do with the AI race. Vistra, being one of the largest electricity generators in the U.S., has acquired 10 new additional natural gas-powered power plants for $4 billion. Vani, this is seen as mostly a way to catch up on this AI race. These natural gas power plants are an answer, at least, to these data-hungry data centers that want energy around the clock. Let's stick with the AI theme and move over to Microchip. This is one of the major analog chip makers, counts TI as one of its main competitors. Had a decent boost when it comes to third quarter sales, and the CEO cited a strong bookings demand for the December quarter. We're seeing Microchip Technology up 4% in pre-market. Lastly, I want to head to Germany. Adidas is getting a double downgrade from Bank of America, essentially downgrading many sportswear brands, Vani, citing the 20-year casualization trend largely coming to an end. Adidas shares down over 6% in Germany.
Oh, that's sad. I don't want that trend to end. Valerie, thank you so much. Valerie Teitel there in London. And we have a great lineup for you this morning. In just moments, we're going to be speaking with the opportunities in oil, particularly in Venezuela, potentially, with Ben Luckock, global head of oil at Trafigura. And as you can see, JPMorgan's Sitara Sundar joins us later this hour on the risks around AI. So Delcy Rodriguez has been sworn in as acting president in Venezuela. For now, she has the support of both the Chavismo's strongholds in her government, as well as President Trump. For more, Bloomberg's Patricia Garup joins us now from Santiago, Chile. So Patricia, she's been sworn in, she's promised peace. How does this government look any different from the government that was there last week?
Yeah, hi, Vani. So not much. This is, again, the same regime with a different leader. She was, as you said, sworn in yesterday by the National Assembly, which is packed with regime loyalists. So the ceremony was important. It cements her control, her political control at the highest level. Strikingly, even Maduro's own son declared his support for her yesterday. So it was a big moment for her, and today's another day.
It does seem that there is not much opposition to her, but from the outside it's very hard to tell. What are we hearing about any other potential factions that might try to, move an opposition government into power, or, move their own people into power if it's at all possible?
Well, it's interesting. Last night, I think a lot of people were on edge because there were sort of these apparently what were unauthorized drone flights around the presidential palace. There were some gunfire. So the people last night, Venezuela watchers, were seeing that and wondering if maybe that was indeed some action to challenge Delcy Rodriguez. It turned out to be a false alarm, apparently. So she is going to have to be very mindful because, yes, there are sort of hardline factions that remain loyal to Hugo Chavez, who was the late president who launched sort of this socialist era in Venezuela more than a quarter century ago.
And just briefly, Patricia, President Trump has told NBC that he may reimburse oil investments in Venezuela. Is that likely to entice people to want to go in? Is that enough?
Well, we can't know yet. Some oil executives are going to be meeting with President Trump this week at the White House. So I think we'll have more details. But yes, he suggested that to entice oil companies to go back into Venezuela and revive that country's oil industry, the government of the United States would subsidize their efforts. Now, also adding that the industry would be up and running, he said, in less than 18 months, which is quite different from the estimates, which say it will take many years and many tens of billions of dollars to do so.
Yeah, very ambitious targets there. Patricia, thank you so much for bringing us up to speed. Patricia Garrett there in Santiago. Joining us now is Ben Luckock. He's Global Head of Oil at Trafigura. Ben, can I start there? OPEC has in the past given you special licenses to trade Venezuelan oil. Are you looking to get into Venezuela in any capacity now that Maduro is out of power, at least for now?
Well, I mean, I think it's the topic that everybody's discussing in the oil industry. We've come back from holiday. We've been back 24 hours in the office. And I can tell you that the office was dominated by Venezuela chat. I think everybody's looking about what opportunities there may be in Venezuela. We have a history of working all over the world, anywhere that oil is produced and anywhere where we follow the sort of sanctions regimes and so on. So we'll be discussing it with the US government. I think we can probably be of assistance. It's very clear the US government wants the oil to continue to flow. They don't want civil unrest in Venezuela, so they're going to want products, gasoline, diesel, this kind of thing to enter the country. And I would say that we are well placed to assist if that's in fact what's required.
Have you had any discussions so far with the administration about any of this, and what kind of opportunities would you be particularly looking at?
I mean, we've had ongoing discussions with this administration and other governments about the world about what's required. I think it's very clear what the Venezuelans want and what the Americans want at the moment seems to be equally aligned. They both want the oil to flow. They both want a stable oil market. And I think you'll find the policy of the US and probably other governments will be aligned to that goal of stability in the oil market, stability of Venezuelan flows and stability within that country. And the country still has requirements for finished grade products to keep its population moving. And I think the policies of both governments will be aligned.
You've had ongoing discussions, you say, with this government and with many governments. Do you get the sense that sanctions will be lifted anytime soon?
Well, I get the sense that they're going to have a policy that does exactly what I said, which will allow the oil to flow. I don't think they want a bottleneck of Venezuelan oil. I don't think they want an armada of ships floating there and waiting to load and so on. It just creates deep inefficiencies. Now that I guess their main goal of Mr. Maduro leaving the country has been achieved, I think they'll get back to the normalcy of keeping the energy markets efficient, keeping it flowing. And I would imagine very, very quickly their policies would reflect that.
What would your asks be at Trafigura, Ben? What would you need to see before you would, allow your services to be used?
I mean, I guess that first and foremost is the safety and security of our people, safety and security who are on our vessels. We have an enormous fleet of oil vessels that are pretty useful in these kind of situations. So that's the first priority for us. And then it's the rules and regulations, right? You mentioned OFAC, there's sanctions and so on. So we've got to make sure there's a proper legal framework that we can operate within. There will be funds that have to be moved, exactly how that works. But the US government is well versed in all of these things. But it'll be a proper legal framework and the safety and security of our people and a high level of transparency of what's going to happen.
Would you be fine with a Delcy Rodriguez government that looks exactly the same like a Maduro government? And would you need reimbursement from the US?
Well, look, we're not here to dictate what governments are around the world and who's in charge. We don't have anything to do with politics, really. And with regards to the US reimbursing, I guess there's two parts to what they're talking about. They're talking about the immediate issue, which is keeping energy flowing both into Venezuela and out of Venezuela. That's a big logistics issue and obviously got some legal issues around it that will need solving. The second part that I know you referenced, Mr. Trump mentioning that he may be interested in reimbursing, this is more the upstream sector. This is going to take years to play out. And there will be some sort of arrangement made, I assume, mostly with the majors, probably American majors, the Chevrons, who participates there at the moment, Exxon, et cetera, et cetera. And that will be a second problem, which will take months and months and months of negotiation to work out exactly how that framework works and how it's funded. But the reality is, Venezuela, for, well, the entirety of my career, has been a very large oil producer. In 1998, it was well in excess of 3 million barrels. These days, it's closer to 1 million barrels. They're clearly going to try and increase production. Increasing production will take tens of billions of dollars and many, many years. There will have to be a framework how the people who invest that money get reimbursed. Now, the normal course of events is you'll be reimbursed through some offtake of the oil and some sort of profit share arrangement. If the American government wishes to assist in that process, then that will probably make it more likely to happen.
How many additional barrels could Venezuela supply, say, this year? And then when would we get back to that 2 to 3 million barrel mark?
I mean, this year, very few. I mean, you don't just click your fingers and change this, and nobody's very clear exactly what shape some of the infrastructure is in, although we do know it's been degraded. I don't think much will change at all this year. What you've really done for the prompt market is take out the likelihood that there's going to be a real problem in Venezuela where they produce substantially less this year because they're in some sort of open conflict or something with the US. And I think that's a little bit off the table now. So I think you've got a certainty around, well, some level of certainty around stability going forward for this year, but don't expect extra barrels to come quickly. You are talking a multi-year process, billions of dollars, but the targets can be significant. Can they get back to their 3 million barrels a day? That will take years, 10, 15, hundreds of billions of dollars to get there. And I think, that remains to be seen. Do I think there's likely to be, a resurgence in interest from the majors to go back to Venezuela and really produce, assuming that the stability remains? Absolutely. This is a country that has enormous oil reserves, the biggest in the world. And yes, in the grand scheme of oil production, it's actually pretty easy to produce. You've just got to get the right people on the ground, the right technology, the right equipment, and money.
Would you be at all interested in investing in refining or other kinds of assets in Venezuela at Trafigura, Ben?
I mean, look, we're open to opportunities. We're traditionally not an upstream producer. We're really a big logistics company. I think where we can immediately help is with the logistic change that we have all over the planet. Now, our know-how about how to move hydrocarbons around the world. Would we be interested in supporting people who wish to go into the upstream market, assuming that all of the legal infrastructure around that are there? I mean, why not? We'll look at it. But I think there's a lot has to transpire before we really understand how the upstream segment in Venezuela is going to play out over the next couple of years.
Ben, how do you think there'll be a wider impact beyond Venezuela? So I'm thinking Ukraine, Russia, even Iran. How does this change the negotiations and the picture for potential oil supply down the road?
Yeah, I mean, that's what the market's been dealing with really for the last couple of years. I mean, we went through a year last year where we had an open conflict between Israel and Iran, and flat price really didn't even go that much higher. Even that was meant to be the big event that would force prices higher, and nothing really ever happened. And when that conflict came to an end, the market came tumbling back off. We're in an oversupplied market is the reality at the moment. Most of the market understands that there's plenty of oil around. Whilst I said the balances don't really change in Venezuela in the next 12 months, at least you've taken for now off the table that you've got a big disruption. So I guess it means probably lower oil prices, both in the prompt and in the medium term. I think Russia, Ukraine, with a bit of luck, 2026 is the year that this war can finally come to an end. You would imagine at that point there'll be some arrangement made where Russian energy at some point will return into the fold, and that's just more supply into a market that already has plenty. The wild card the market is worried about at the moment, or the bullish wild card, I would say, is Iran. Lots of talk about what's the current situation. Are the Americans going to act again? But frankly speaking, there's plenty of oil in the world at the moment. And, absent a huge problem, I don't foresee significantly higher prices, almost regardless of what events happen with Iran, with Ukraine, and with the Venezuela that looks to be a bit more stable at the moment.
Yeah, at Trafigura, you've coined the phrase super glut for what you think the oil market is in this year. Can I ask you about Tether? Because I know that you're involved as well in Tether and other assets like that, in particular a stable coin that some of these regimes use. What's your outlook for Tether and how it's going to be used this year?
I mean, look, Alternative payment systems are certainly very interesting. I mean, we deal with an enormous amount of US dollars every day, but we are aware that the world is changing and moving forward, and people do want to peg their currencies to different things. Gold has certainly had a big move up in the last, 12 months, hasn't it, as people and central banks have been buying gold. Again, we will live within the regulations of the international markets. I think if there's ways that you can have payment systems that are, let's call it more modern, more forward-looking, fine. We'll work with it. I know we've looked at a number of these things over time, but the reality is the commodities market operates largely on US dollars through the traditional banking system. That hasn't changed for many, many years. So any change is likely to be slow in commodities. It's large amounts of money all over the planet, and it's really very rule-bound. I mean, this is not a cowboy industry. It's very well regulated. So look, I suspect it changes slowly over time, but I don't think it's going to be a dramatic change in 2026 to what we do every day.
Ben, can't wait to get an update from you very soon, and good luck with all the negotiations and everything to come. That's Ben Luckock of Trafigura. This is Bloomberg.
This is the Vera CPU. It's got 88 CPU cores, and the CPU cores are designed to be multi-threaded. But the multi-threaded nature of Vera was designed so that each one of the 176 threads could get its full performance. So it's essentially as if there's 176 cores, but only 88 physical cores. So these cores were designed in using a technology called spatial multi-threading. But the I/O performance is incredible.
NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang showing off the company's latest accelerator at CES in Las Vegas. Joining us now for highlights, Bloomberg Tech Europe anchor Tom McKenzie. Certainly sounded great, Tom, but what was he actually saying? What does this do for the world?
Yeah, and setting the tone, really, in terms of how to think about some of the key trends through 2026. Of course, the spotlight very much on Jensen Huang yesterday, ahead of the official start of CES in Las Vegas later today. A couple of things really stood out. One was the fact that this is a Jensen Huang who is announcing details around that latest chipset that you saw there, the soundbite, ahead of normal schedule. They're normally going to be announcing these in around the springtime at their own event, but he pulled that forward, and he said that's simply because they're seeing so much demand in terms of the use, the complexity around the new AI use cases and the demand coming through from customers, that he felt compelled to give these details and give an update, and said they're very much on track for this latest chipset, the Vera Rubin, that is currently in production, he said, and will be shipped to customers in the second half of this year. I think another key piece of the commentary, at least the press conference from Jensen Huang, was around that demand story, just saying, look, we are seeing no let-up in demand. That, in fact, was echoed by the CEO of AMD, Lisa Su, a competitor, of course, to NVIDIA, who also said they're seeing incredibly strong demand just in the opening stages of where this story goes. And he also had interesting takes on the China piece, and maybe we can get some more details on that. But this, again, was a Jensen Huang setting out not just the demand story, but also how the story evolves in terms of AI, a focus on robotics, a focus on embedded AI, and coming out with new solutions, new software when it comes to autonomous vehicles. So there was a lot, but I think it was the pre-announcement around some of the details of the Rubin and some of that additional software and services coming to robotics, the industrial use cases, and autonomous vehicles.
Well, certainly NVIDIA is higher in the pre-market. Now, interestingly, he also talked about the H200 chip, and we know there's been so much controversy about this. We're not even sure that the US can, export it to China. That decision's still not fully been made, right, Tom? But what did he say?
Yeah, that's right. What was interesting on this, I think, is that he said they're seeing strong demand from their customers in China for H200s. They have to have those licenses approved. He says they're working through that process. The licensing applications for those H200 shipments are in with the US government. And of course, to your point, the Trump administration has suggested that potentially they could sign off on those shipments. That could open up a market that NVIDIA has previously suggested could be worth as much as $50 billion US.
Yeah, fascinating. Tom, thank you so much. That's Tom McKenzie. And don't miss our special coverage live from CES, starting at 11 a.m. Eastern. Do tune in Friday as well for the next episode of Bloomberg Tech Europe, featuring Will I Am. That's at 3:30 a.m. New York time, 8:30 a.m. in London. Coming up, President Trump has hinted oil executives to get ready weeks before the Maduro ouster. That and a look at what else is making headlines in your front page news next. This is Bloomberg. Time now for your front page news. First up, on the Wall Street Journal, President Trump's vague but tantalizing message to oil executives weeks before the Maduro ouster. Get ready. According to sources, he didn't provide the executives with specific details of the strikes on Caracas, nor did he seek their advice on a plan to have U.S. energy companies revitalize Venezuela's dilapidated oil fields. Next up, on the New York Times, President Trump's top aide, Stephen Miller, asserting that Greenland rightfully belongs to the United States. In a CNN interview, Miller said that, quote, nobody's going to fight the United States militarily over the future of Greenland. Meanwhile, the Danish Prime Minister said that if Trump were to attack, that would mean the end of the NATO alliance. And the Washington Post is leading with the Trump administration overhauling the list of routine shots recommended for all babies and children. Medical associations and public health experts have condemned the revisions to the vaccine schedule. Coming up, we're going to speak with JPMorgan's Sitara Sundar next. This is Bloomberg. It's 5:30 a.m. in New York City. Good morning. I'm Bonnie Quinn with your Bloomberg Brief. Here's what you need to know. A new leader. Venezuela swears in Delcy Rodriguez as acting president, as her predecessor, Nicolas Maduro, pleads not guilty in U.S. court. An AI showdown in Vegas. NVIDIA says its Rubin data center processors are in production. More from CES coming up. And stocks extending their New Year's rally. Copper continuing its climb above $13,000 a ton. So let's take a look at how we're faring now. So we have a mixed picture futures-wise, but that's coming off a great session. The S&P closing up 6.6% yesterday. The Nasdaq 100 was up nearly 0.8%. As you can see, overnight in Asia, we had another very strong session. I'm not sure you could call this one catch-up. Certainly was impacted by some of the NVIDIA comments out of CES overnight, also headlines out of the PBOC. They're going to prop up market, at least trustworthiness, let's put it that way. Let's take a look at the bond universe, because we might see some movement this week off the back of jobs report Friday. Not too much movement today, though. We're seeing yields pretty much stable at the front end, up about a basis point at the 10-year. And 2 basis points at the long end. And let's take a look at that copper price, because it does continue to rise. We're well above now $13,000 a ton and continuing to climb. All right, let's get to some individual movers now for some stocks to watch. Here's Valerie Teitel. Valerie.
Good morning, Evani. Let's start with the energy space with Vistra Corporations announcing they spent $4 billion acquiring 10 new gas-powered power plants in order to catch up with the AI race. We're seeing Vistra Corporations up 4.3% in pre-market trade. Now, natural gas power is seen as an answer to those data-hungry data centers that want energy around the clock. Well, sticking with the AI theme, I want to talk about Core Scientific. It received an upgrade from BTIG, and we're seeing shares headed higher in the pre-market by 4.6%. Vonnie, Core Scientific was one of the biggest listed Bitcoin miners and is now becoming a key player in the AI digital infrastructure space, building out those AI data centers. So a key player again with this AI story, lifting stocks across the spectrum this morning. Lastly, I want to end on pharma. Novo Nordisk, just 2 weeks after receiving regulatory approval for its weight loss pill, will begin selling it across the U.S. in 70,000 pharmacies. Novo Nordisk was one of the key gainers in the European session, and as the ADRs are headed higher by just shy of 5% off the back of this excitement about the potential volumes and margins that Novo Nordisk could gain.
Yeah, launch day. I'm sure there'll be plenty of happy clients out there as well. Valerie, thank you so much. Valerie Teitel there in London. Well, the bull run is not over, but drivers are evolving. That's according to JPMorgan's Sitara Sundar. She writes this: broader earnings participation and secular growth drivers suggest there is still fuel in the tank. We're also increasingly more constructive on core private equity after 3 years of underperformance. Pleased to say Sitara joins us now. She's head of alternative investment strategy at JPMorgan Private Bank. So, evolving drivers, but yes, the bull run will continue. What are some of these evolving drivers? Dig a little bit deeper for us.
Yeah, definitely. First, thank you so much for having me, and Happy New Year. I think When we look at 2026 versus 2025, there are a couple of things that are similar. We think that artificial intelligence, even where we are in the cycle right now, is going to continue to bolster not just technology through semiconductors, but the CapEx cycle is still going to continue. So that's also going to support some of the AI infrastructure plays when you think about industrials and utilities. Now, what's different this year is this idea that we're finally going to see this long-awaited broadening of earnings growth into sectors outside of just those that are influenced by artificial intelligence alone. So when we think about that, when you look at 2026, we expect double-digit earnings growth for 7 out of the 11 gig sectors. And when you think about the sectors that we're positive on, financials is starting to come back into the forefront, not just on the benefits that you would get from a steepening yield curve, but also the increase in capital market activity. Healthcare, after being in the doldrums for multiple years, we're starting to see a revival in M&A activity, drug innovation, especially as patent cliffs start to become more and more of an issue over the next few years. But then separately, truly, when I think about the beneficiaries of a broadening in earnings growth, that's not just a public market story. That is truly a private market story as well. And when you think about the median buyout manager, at least within the United States, that has had a tough time versus the S&P 500 and the Russell 1000 growth, and even some of the smaller cap indices over the past few years, given this AI-fueled rally within the hyperscalers that exist primarily within public markets, that broadening earnings growth story should set up well for core private equity managers this year.
Definitely want to talk more about private equity in a moment, but I do want to ask you, every time we had a sort of a CapEx announcement, the market wasn't quite sure how to take it last year. So, you know, is that going to happen again this year if you get more CapEx announcements, or do we need to see the spending, you know, happen and then for there to be a positive impact on the bottom line?
The ROI needs to be there this year. I think that your point is a very good one in the sense that we're moving towards a part in the cycle. We're now 3 years into the cycle. We're moving towards a period of time where we need to see, and markets need to see, and investors need to see that the capital that's being put to work is actually impacting profitability. But interestingly, I mean, research is a little bit mixed on this, but there are some studies that show that those who are AI forward companies have actually been growing revenues at about 1.7 times those that are not incorporating artificial intelligence into their ecosystems. So we're already starting to see the impacts in real time. But yes, I do agree that the return on investment and profitability is going to be critical, not just for justifying the CapEx expenditure and dissuading people from viewing that AI is a bubble, which we do not believe, but also to see an increase in adoption rates for enterprises.
Now, you talked about core private equity.
Yes.
I mean, does the great time start now, or are we going to build up to it? And why should the tide be turning for core private equity?
Yeah, I think there's two different fundamental drivers, and I tend to bifurcate it. One is what we're seeing in capital market activity, and we're starting to see IPO volumes and windows start to open up, and we expect this year to be a strong year from not just IPO activity, but M&A activity as well. Part of that is due to the sentiment starting to improve within markets, but the other part of that is resilient economic growth and easing financial conditions. Historically, easing financial conditions has been positively correlated with increase in deal making. And then two, it's the underlying fundamental drivers at the end of the day. Core private equity, in a similar way to how we underwrite companies on the public side, it's a earnings growth story. And I think what surprises people, and sometimes even surprises me, is that if you look at the median private company, it's actually grown earnings at 11.5% over the past decade, and we expect that to continue and accelerate this year.
Will there be themes within that, though? So core private equity that's been involved in, say, the energy transition, or you know, the AI energy or the data center universe, will they have better luck this year than some of the others?
Yeah, I think that when we think about opportunities moving forward, there's 3 buckets. The first is when we just mentioned artificial intelligence, the idea that we're moving from the infrastructure and starting to broaden into the application layer. 95% of software companies are within private markets. if you want to get access to the application layer, which could be a $6 trillion opportunity by 2030, that only exists in private markets. So that'll be a strong bolster and support for earnings growth moving forward. But separately, when you think about healthcare innovation, 70% of drug innovation actually happens through M&A. Big pharma companies kind of buying these like small and mid-cap type of biotech companies. And that drug innovation primarily happens within private markets. And then finally, the security theme that you mentioned, when you think about energy transition, supply chain security, and defense technology, there's a lot of innovation that we're seeing within venture capital and growth within that space.
How careful do private equity markets have to be, though? Because just as public markets are built on trust, there's a lot of trust that's needed in private equity too. And if that goes away, then we could have a problem, right? So you don't want to go to somebody with a deal when, the market is not ready for it.
So I think there's a couple of ways that I would think about that. One, in a similar way to how we think about public markets and the idea that active management is critical in a public market environment that is becoming increasingly concentrated. Similarly, from a manager selection perspective, what we're seeing within private equity is that the industry itself is not stagnating, but it is stratifying. And what I mean by that is we're in a changing macroeconomic environment, especially post-GFC. When you looked at private equity managers post-GFC to kind of call it pre-2022, about 50% of the returns were due to multiple expansion and leverage. That formula is going to change moving forward because we're in a period of time where rates are going to be higher, inflation is going to be higher, and while economic growth is going to be strong, it'll probably be closer to potential. So that operational know-how, those that can actually leverage artificial intelligence to increase profitability within those underlying companies, that operational improvement to improve underlying earnings growth is going to be critical for private equity managers moving forward.
Sitara, thank you so much. An optimistic view to kick off the year. That is Sitara Sundar of JPMorgan Private Bank. Now to other top stories trending on the terminal this morning. China is imposing export controls on dual-use items to Japan, those with the capacity to be used for military purposes. The Commerce Ministry says the move is to safeguard its national security interests. In a separate statement, China again criticized the Japanese Prime Minister's recent comments over Taiwan. Michael Platt's private trading firm Bluecrest Capital Management gained 73% last year, according to Bloomberg sources. Bluecrest's returns since 2016 are estimated to be more than 7,800% based on compounding returns and assuming no capital is taken out of the firm each year. And the Trump administration's attempt to slash billions in NIH research overhead costs rejected by a federal appeals court on Monday. That's driving European life science stocks higher, helping to boost the stock 600 healthcare index. Coming up, Venezuela regroups. Delcy Rodriguez is sworn in as acting president as Maduro has his day in U.S. court. That's next. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Brief. I'm Bonnie Quinn in New York. Venezuela has sworn in Delcy Rodriguez as the acting president. This after Nicolas Maduro faced the courts in New York City. Let's bring in Mika Solner of Bloomberg Government in Washington for more. Mika, so we have an acting president now in Venezuela. How secure is Delcy Rodriguez in that role, and how stable is Venezuela going to continue to be?
Yeah, I think right now all eyes are on her in terms of how she is actually going to coordinate with the U.S. when it comes to what Trump is adamant on saying is going to be a complete takeover of Venezuela. He has mentioned that she seems to be gracious and willing in some ways, but she's given out mixed statements in terms of how she feels about Maduro's capture. I mean, at one point she called it barbaric, and then she softened her tone. So we're really going to have to see what her posturing is going to be here when it comes to her leadership and how strong she wants to go against or work with the U.S.
And she'll have to satisfy many factions in Venezuela herself. Now, President Trump has asked Marco Rubio to lead the Venezuela overhaul after the Maduro arrest. What do we know about what Rubio wants to accomplish in Venezuela?
Yeah, I think that there is a lot of questions that we're going to find out more answers today. President Trump is going to brief House Republicans, but Marco Rubio obviously has his plate full, and he's been kind of a go-to person when it comes to Trump's foreign affairs agenda. But this was really actually one of Rubio's top priorities was Venezuela and kind of leading the ground game when it comes to those strikes and coordinating, in that aspect. So this is really obviously a top issue for him. So, we'll see what he does here.
And then Trump floated the idea to NBC, in fact, that he might reimburse Venezuela oil investments. So that would, I guess, incentivize some of the big oil companies to perhaps go in. Do we have any more details about what those incentives might be?
Little detail yet, but I think that's, again, something that's going to come up today.
Talk to us about Ukraine. European and US officials are in Paris at the moment. In fact, Zelensky has just arrived in Paris, and we know now that that meeting is going to include Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. What are we hoping that might achieve this meeting?
Yeah, I think the meeting today is largely going to be surrounded, focused on Ukraine security protocols. I mean, that's been a top issue here, and the administration has been really pushing to quickly try and reach a deal between Russia and Ukraine, and they've been trying to advocate for both sides. Obviously, there's been some criticism that the administration is playing too much into Russia, so I think this is going to be a really, really, really critical talk here.
Mika, thank you. Mika Solner of Bloomberg Government. Turning to tech, the CES show kicking off in Las Vegas.
This is the Vera CPU. It's got 88 CPU cores, and the CPU cores are designed to be multi-threaded. But the multi-threaded nature of Vera was designed so that each one of the 176 threads could get its full performance. So it's essentially as if there's 176 cores, but only 88 physical cores. So these cores were designed in using a technology called spatial multi-threading. But the I/O performance is incredible.
NVIDIA's chip announcement following others from the big players. Joining us now is Bloomberg's Neil Campling. Neil, what did we hear that we weren't expecting to hear out of at least the first day of CES keynote speeches?
Yeah, I think one of the really key things today is that what we've heard so far is now we're getting practical AI agents in products, rather than just pure AI concepts. So there's been a lot of focus, obviously, on hyperscalers and data centers. And what I think we've had so far at CES is we're actually now seeing devices and products that are integrating these AI solutions. And we heard actually, first of all, from Samsung at the start of CES, who basically talked about Gemini with 400 million smartphones using AI Gemini and expecting to get to 800 million by the end of this year. That is proper adoption curves as we see it for technology, which is key, I think, to taking now the concept of AI into the adoption layer that will help to justify the investment curve and the ROI for these big tech companies.
Yeah, beginning to see the shift there. We also saw AMD unveiling a new chip, and this specifically for corporate data centers. Tell us about this chip and whether it's revolutionary or not.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously for AMD, often described and seen as the closest competitor to NVIDIA. And as you're having the upcoming call with the CEO, and I think that you're here, and we heard last night that AMD believe they are just getting started in terms of the AI there, and we're seeing performance metrics that really back up the technology innovation curve. And so what you'll see probably down the line from here is as the adoption takes off, you'll see the pricing of those AI chips come down, because actually what we need to remember is tech should be deflationary for mass adoption, which is positive for the tech adoption curve. And AMD clearly are on track in terms of their tech curve to improve with the new AI chips that were announced overnight.
Another thing that was interesting was Intel showing off computers. Are we all going to be getting back to our Intel computers again? Obviously, it's going to be central to Intel's comeback, Neil.
Yeah, absolutely. So the new platform here, which is the 18A technology for Intel for the new notebooks, laptops, it's the first products on this new platform. As they've said, it's key to really their comeback What needs to be seen from here is whether users adopt those new laptops, but at least we are now seeing those first products coming out on the market. Now that's key because in the last 5 years or so, Intel have often missed the innovation curve and missed the launch dates for their products. So at least we're getting some positive news from them in terms of the timing of these releases for these new platform and the new chipsets.
And that was only evening one. Lots more to look forward to out of CES. Neil Cantling, thank you so much for all of that context. Coming up, we're going to get you set up for your trading day with inflation data and, of course, Fed speak ahead. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Brief. I'm Bonnie Quinn in New York. Now let's take a look at what's ahead today, your Tuesday session. So we kick things off with Richmond Fed President Tom Barkin, who's speaking at 8 a.m. Eastern, the first Fed speak of the year. And then we get services and composite PMI. That's at 9:45 Eastern, continuing the raft of economic data, which will obviously culminate in the jobs report Friday. And do tune into our special coverage live from CES starting at 11 a.m. Eastern. Now we have interviews with tech giants from Lisa Su to NVIDIA's Jensen Huang, Qualcomm's Cristiano Amon, and many, many more. Now let's take a look at some pre-market movers. Vista, it's agreed to pay roughly $4 billion for 10 natural gas-fired power plants in the U.S. Northeast and Texas. It's obviously deepening its AI bet, and that's lifting the stock as we see this burst of AI enthusiasm kicking off the new year. Microchip Technology up another 4.25%. It's lifted its sales forecast and beat estimates. And of course, earnings season in general starts again just in a couple of weeks' time. Zeta Global also higher by 11% here. This on reports of a strategic collaboration with OpenAI to power conversational intelligence and agentic applications. Is it any wonder we're seeing this burst of AI enthusiasm send these stocks higher? Let's take a look at the macro picture though, because after an update yesterday for the major indices, 0.6% for the S&P 500, 0.8% for the Nasdaq 100. We're seeing a mixed picture today, so very small moves for the major indices. But do take a look at the MSCI Asia Pacific Index. It was up 1.2% for a second day of gains. And we also have headlines out of the PBOC in the last hour saying that they're going to use the RRR and other monetary policy tools very flexibly this year and going to shore up confidence in China's markets. Let's take a look at bonds. We're seeing just a basis point or two higher towards the longer end of the curve. And then look at copper. It's continuing its run higher, front loading in the United States in case there are more tariffs later in the year. It's above 13,100 a ton now. That's it for Bloomberg Brief. Surveillance continues the conversation.